It looks like I can. Please go ahead, Ruby.
Thank you. Hello, everyone, and thanks for showing up for our monthly meetup, which is usually the last Tuesday of the month. For those who do not know me, I'm Ruby Golo, and I look after the Global Chamber Accra Metro. I also run a consulting firm called Global Trade Consult, and we help overseas companies expand into Ghana with their products and services. Some few housekeeping. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you are called to speak. But feel free to network using the chat room. And of course, you can post your full contact details so others can reach out to you directly. Global Chamber is the only chamber that operates in many countries around the world. Our business is simple. We like to help companies connect with trusted business people. And if you like what we do here today and you would like to join the Global Tribe, then please feel free to talk to me after this event. Today we have our own member, Keyaan Williams of CLASS LLC, based in the US, who is passionate advocate for risk governance, successful deployment of enterprise risk, cybersecurity, and data privacy programs for a range of organizations. We are fortunate to have him back in the room to present to us. So nice to see you, Keyaan. Please take the floor and tell us more about yourself and what you have to share with us today.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad that you're having me back. For those of you who may not have been in the previous session, I had a family situation that required me to present from the car, and we still had a fantastic conversation. So today I'm in the home base, I'm seated, I have good internet, and I hope to lead a good conversation about risk governance. One of the things to keep in mind as we have the conversation is that most of the things that I'm going to tell you are based on my experience, not based on academic theory. And so for over 12 years, I worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I had the pleasure of running some large programs. My passion for Africa is related to the PEPFAR program, where the United States invested a significant amount of money and continues to do so related to AIDS eradication. But my work with the CDC started my global adventures. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope that the things that I've done over the last 30 years that I've consolidated into this one presentation are going to be valuable for everybody who's participating. In addition to the consulting firm that I own, I am also a we'll say former because you never retire, but I'm not currently teaching. I used to be a university professor, so I taught at the graduate school at Georgia State University in Atlanta. I was a graduate professor at Claflin University, which is a historically black college in South Carolina. And so I've been teaching this academically while at the same time putting the items into practice. And I would submit to you that the educational perspective and the practical perspective qualify me to lead this conversation. Because I'm a teacher, we laid out learning objectives. And so our learning objectives for this session, there are really three things that I would like people to take away from the conversation. Number one is related to a frustration that I run into professionally. Usually, when I talk to somebody about risk, most non technical business people say that management of technology risk belongs to somebody else. The issue with that is that when we have apathy and disengagement from organizational leaders, we tend to have significantly more problems. And so, my role as an advocate for good risk governance is to engage everybody in the company to understand their role, their responsibility, and to make sure that they are participating in understanding the problems and contributing to the solutions. The other thing that I'd like to accomplish is to make sure that everybody understands the real requirements for enterprise risk management, especially when we talk about those requirements applying to artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity risk. Again, what tends to happen is the marketplace, vendors, professional associations, people who want to gain something from what they're promoting frame the problem in one way that is very different than the actual solutions that exist. And so instead of presenting technology solutions as we communicate about the problem, my objective is to highlight standards and frameworks that anybody who's participating can adopt. You can use those standards and frameworks to drive how you're going to implement the solutions within your own organizations. And then that leads this to be a good educational session. And so number 3 is tied to number 2. If you understand uncommon frameworks, because these aren't related to compliance or regulation, but they're standards of good practice, then you can achieve successful outcomes and not build an approach that satisfies regulatory requirements, but rather helps the organization do the right thing because it's the right thing. Again, because I'm a professor, I've listed all of the resources that influence the conversation that we're having today. In March of 2026, Ruby and I will host a full day training session in Accra that I think will be very valuable. And these are some of the resources that we'll go into more detail about. But I've sent the slides to Ruby. She can distribute them to everybody who's interested. But these resources become very valuable when you look at the question, what do I need to do to be successful? If we look at the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, they have 2 resources that I found very valuable for academic and for professional work. The principles of corporate governance define the rules of the road. What are the 6 things that every organization has to do so that their operations are trustworthy, resilient, transparent, safe, and produce desirable outcomes. And then the Corporate Governance Fact Book is released every odd calendar year. I think they've been doing it for 14 years, if I remember the series correctly. But the recent fact book came out at the end of October. It has great content, and what the fact book does in conjunction with the principles of corporate governance is it analyzes over the past 2 years how well have organizations followed the practices, how have they implemented the principles, and what impact does that make on public markets from a global perspective. ISO 37000 is also a good resource. The concept risk governance that we're talking about today is embedded within that framework. And so risk governance is not the only governance activity, but if you don't provide good governance of enterprise risk, not just technology, but risk related to revenue, operations, regulatory requirements, the reputation of the company, and the safety of the employees and customers, well, then you failed and you're likely going to have an impact that leads to insolvency. And so ISO 37000 as a global standard provides a great framework that people can build upon, that while it's not free, it's also not extremely expensive, and it doesn't require the same investment that you would see if you hired a consulting firm to tell you what the standard says. Because of my work in the government, I'm familiar with 2 documents from the National Institute of Standards and Technology. This is not really a cybersecurity conversation as much as we're going to talk about security controls and what you need to do. This is a business risk conversation, but NIST IR 8286 is one of the best documents in the marketplace that is freely available. It's easy to download. It highlights if cybersecurity is a concern, how do you take those concerns and integrate them into a program for enterprise risk management so that all stakeholders of the company are involved in the solutions. Similarly, NIST special publication 800-221 focuses on the impact of information and communications technology risk. And the artifact that you get from this, and the reason that I highlight it, is because it provides a framework for producing a risk register. One of the things that I'll talk about as we go forward in the presentation is the value of having an inventory of all of your risks and then having an action plan that says, given everything that's on the list, how do we prioritize remediation so that we can reduce negative consequences for the organization? So 800-221 is a good resource. Again, avoiding hiring consultants, but requiring some meaningful reading, but puts the leaders of organizations in a good position to drive what people should be doing for the company. The penultimate item that's on the list comes from the Financial Stability Board. One of the things that I found in my consulting work, more than my academic work, is that organizations that have a formally documented risk appetite framework tend to manage risk much more effectively than everybody else. And so based on the standard, there's a good approach that people can adopt. You can just read the standard, understand what it calls for, but it provides good criteria for organizations to put that framework in place. And then the framework drives positive outcomes. The final resource is a textbook that I use for some of my graduate classes and that I've incorporated into other training materials. But the Essentials of Risk Management is written by, I know one of the authors and I'm familiar with the other people, but is written by people that do risk management for a living. So it looks at risk from a banking and finance perspective. There are some items related to insurance, and there are items related to enterprise risk management that are all combined into a single book that covers the entire process from a comprehensive perspective. Now, if you've done other global chamber events, and I've done many of them, what you're probably thinking is that, Keyaan, I didn't sign up for a college course that we're going to complete within an hour. I understand that this might be different than usual, but my objective in today's conversation is to make sure that people really have access to resources that are going to be beneficial, even if we do nothing else together in the future. And so these resources are good tools that are going to help anybody who decides to participate with us. Members now and members who listen to the recording later are all going to benefit from knowing the background for the content that I put together. And so if we move forward in the presentation part, now that we've finished the academic exploration, one of the questions that we want to answer is, what is risk governance? And so again, being a nerdy professor, we have a formula that says where risk is a measure of uncertainty and governance describes the system of rules, practices, and processes by which a company is directed and controlled. Risk governance puts in place everything that's required for business leaders, the board of directors, the chief executive officer, the C-suite, to make decisions about risk, to understand the risk that exists within the organization, and then to ensure that risk is reduced to an acceptable level. And so my concept, risk governance, is really the combination of enterprise risk management and a classical definition of governance where the board of directors and the C-suite direct the resources and the activity of the organization to make sure that the organization is delivering what they promise to their stakeholders. This applies if you're a nonprofit, if you're a commercial organization, if it's an institute of higher learning, and even for government organizations. Every organization is going to have some level of uncertainty that could have positive or negative consequences, and every organization is going to have governance practices in place that equip the organization to deal with and respond to that uncertainty. And so our risk governance concept just prioritizes the activities of leadership to assess, understand, and respond to risks that the company is facing. Doing that well leads to positive outcomes. Doing that poorly leads to negative consequences. Now, the thing that's important, and I alluded to this when we opened the conversation, is that business risk is the focus of this conversation. I've spent almost 30 years doing technology, cybersecurity, privacy, and AI risk. But in every case, technology, cybersecurity, AI, and privacy have an impact on the 5 key risk areas that are listed on the slide. None of those items are ever the primary risk of the organization. My company, CLASS-LLC, is a cybersecurity consulting company. I care much more about revenue and resilience and the regulatory environment that we have to operate in, and the reputation of the company and the safety of people engaging with us, than I care about a checklist of cybersecurity controls that need to be in place. And as I've talked to larger companies, because my company is, we're doing okay, but we're not huge like Equifax or Microsoft or Delta Airlines or some of the global organizations. Every organization at the governance level, when you talk to the board of directors, is focused on how well are we doing for these key business risks. Everything else that relates to these risks is just what is going to have an impact on it. So bad cybersecurity is not the primary risk driver, but it does have an impact on revenue. Misuse of artificial intelligence is not the primary driver for most organizations, but if you use artificial intelligence improperly, it has a regulatory impact that could lead to fines, especially considering things like the European Union AI Act, which extends the benefits to all citizens of the European Union, regardless of where they exist in the world. So if I create manufacturing equipment, the equipment uses artificial intelligence, the European Union says it's a high-risk AI system, and the people in Brussels, even if I'm based in Ghana, are going to come after me because their citizens were harmed as a result of my activities. And so it becomes extremely important in a conversation like this that we don't just focus on AI and cybersecurity and technology and privacy, but we really focus on what does the business care about, and then how do those concerns have an impact on the real risks that the organization is facing. This is much more aligned with risk governance and enterprise risk management than a very narrow focus on a specific concern within the business. The narrow focus is dangerous because programs that are built based on narrow focus have narrow impact. And so if you take something like the payment card industry data security standard, I cannot process credit cards globally if I don't satisfy the requirements for PCI DSS. But most companies that have had a cybersecurity, a privacy, or an AI incident satisfy the requirements for the payment card industry. And so focusing specifically on one standard causes organizations to spend a lot of resources in one place, but then underspend on resources in other places, and it leads to negative outcomes overall. If you think about what I highlighted, this slide really just provides in text, why does risk governance matter? And so risk governance, the board of directors and the C-suite working together to make sure that mechanisms are in place to protect revenue is going to be valuable. Because if you exhaust all of your revenue, then you have no money to pay your bills, to cover your operations, to pay your employees, and then the company is insolvent and you've gone out of business. And so it's a business perspective that we're looking at this. If we protect revenue by aligning risk tolerance with financial strategy, we're likely to have good outcomes. We can use risk governance from the board and the C-suite perspective to ensure that the company is resilient because we've done proactive planning, we've done business continuity, disaster recovery, incident response, crisis communications. All of those things are performed by management and staff, but oversight from the board and the C-suite becomes very important to make sure that priorities are identified and people perform at an acceptable level. The same idea also applies to satisfying regulatory obligations. There was a great comment in the chat about some impacts in South Africa. And we also want to safeguard the reputation of the organization with effective and transparent communication and ethical leadership. Years ago, at the beginning of my work at Georgia State in the graduate school, I had my students actually do analysis. And what they found is that reputation matters when switching costs are high. So we're getting into some very nerdy graduate school business 101 concepts, but reputation matters for small, medium, and even some large businesses if you have a lot of competitors in the marketplace. As an example, in the United States, we had a major breach years ago of a retail organization called Target. For a period of time, everybody stopped shopping at Target because they didn't trust their ability to protect financial information. Target's stock price went down, they lost revenue, there were all kinds of impacts. And Target is a very large organization that doesn't have a lot of competition, but they had enough competition that there was an impact on the company resulting from bad cybersecurity. What becomes even more interesting is that as you look at smaller and smaller companies, 2/3 of small and medium businesses, and that's businesses up to $50 million in revenue, cease to exist within a year when they don't manage their risk well. They have a major incident that affects any of the 4 areas that are on the slide. They're just out of business, even if they're making $50 million per year, because customers lose confidence in the company and the customers go somewhere else to do business. So some of the things that I highlighted on the previous slide relate to a specific case study that I've been working with the chief executive officer of the formal company. And so there is a company that did shipping and logistics that was in the UK. The company was over 100 years old. They had $100 million in annual recurring revenue from their operations. The board of directors did all of the things that they're supposed to do, talking about cybersecurity, having it on the agenda. For those of you that are familiar with ISO, they had a certified cybersecurity program based on the information security management system. The company had tens of millions of dollars in cyber liability insurance. And according to the marketplace, they checked every box that was required for them to say we're doing the right things. The company still went out of business. The reason that they went out of business, everything that led to their insolvency was preventable. They had insurance, but they had not considered what is the sequence of payouts, what is the timeliness of payouts, what are the requirements of the insurance company to make sure that we get the financial relief that's necessary after having a ransomware attack. The root cause of the ransomware attack was that somebody did not follow a documented policy that was written in the organization. So they had the policy, they failed to do policy enforcement. Bad password allowed third party hackers to gain access to the environment and to distribute ransomware. And because of the length of time that it took for them to receive the money that they needed for insurance, they exhausted all their financial resources and went out of business. And so while a ransomware attack is significant, number one, ransomware is preventable technologically. And number two, you should have business continuity plans in place that are not exclusive to technology or security, but are business resilience activities that need to be considered so that you know how long can you operate if there's an outage, what are the requirements for restoring operations. All of those are business activities. In this case, the company went out of business, even if they did everything that the industry would expect for cybersecurity and technology management. This leads to a conversation about roles and responsibilities. It is not just the IT person or the cybersecurity person who is supposed to play a part in enterprise risk management or risk governance, but everybody who influences the management of business risk has a role to play. So the board of directors, from a classical governance perspective, is supposed to provide oversight, ask the right questions, understand the answer to those questions, and then drive outcomes that are beneficial for the company. The chief executive officer is supposed to represent the company in public and be the senior leader within the organization. The chief operating officer is supposed to make sure that operations function within acceptable risk boundaries. The C-suite at the management level is going to make sure the right resources are in place. Middle managers are going to be the people on the ground performing the actions. Staff are accountable for following the rules as they're documented. All of these roles have to understand their specific role, their specific responsibilities within the risk governance framework for an organization to be successful. If you look on the left side of the slide, there's a reference to NIST, Special Publication 800-39. I only give that reference because I didn't create this pyramid originally. What's valuable about this pyramid is that NIST 800-39 focuses on enterprise management of cybersecurity programs within a company. When I worked at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, we had over 1,000 distinct information systems distributed across 36 countries. We had 75,000 employees. This framework allowed us to take a hierarchical approach to make sure that every center, institute, and office had leadership, management, and staff who knew exactly what they needed to do to contribute to the mission of the organization. So when I worked in the Global AIDS program, we followed this model. There was a leader for the program. There were managers that provided reporting, and then there were staff that followed the directions. It doesn't really matter the size of the company. The framework is the framework. And the idea within the framework is that from the top down, it is a strategic perspective that focuses on where are we going, how are we getting there, and what is required for success. From the bottom up, it's more tactical. So we get into granular details about how our systems, services, applications, and people operating to produce the strategic outcome. What becomes beneficial is that in this model, the board and the CEO are responsible for governance. The C-suite, everybody who is a chief of something, is responsible for corporate operations and accomplishing the corporate mission. And then staff and vendors are responsible for everything that falls into the bucket of information systems or data that's processed for the benefit of the organization. A framework like this is beneficial because it helps identify who is responsible for what. If I were having this conversation with IT people, with cybersecurity people, with finance people, there's an opportunity to extrapolate for you in your role. This is where you fit. This is how you contribute to success, but this is how you contribute in the larger picture rather than just isolating individuals and saying, Mr. or Mrs. CFO, you are wholly responsible for all of the money that is used within the organization. So if some random person commits fraud, the CFO is not really responsible. The CFO puts a framework in place, and based on that framework, everybody knows how to operate. That concept becomes important because there are multiple approaches for multiple business domains that all have to be organized. NIST 800-39 provides that organization. From that, if we focus just on the board and the CEO, which is why level one was highlighted in green, the outcomes that you have for risk governance are primarily driven by the senior leadership within the organization. If you do not have a board of directors, then we're just saying the owner of the company or the C-suite or the senior leadership team, they have to come to an agreement about what is the risk appetite of the company, what are the acceptable risk boundaries. It has to be documented and it has to be enforced. In the Financial Stability Board, they talk about the principles for an effective risk appetite statement. The definitions for risk appetite and risk capacity become important in this conversation. So risk appetite just represents the type of risk and the amount of risk that an organization is willing to pursue as it's trying to generate value. So if I want to sell 5,000 widgets, well, there are operational risks and revenue risks and safety risks and compliance risks. And I have to decide what is the boundary of risk that I'm willing to accept as I'm trying to gather resources from a mine, put them on a truck, bring them to my factory, organize those raw materials into the product that we're going to deliver, and then ship the product to the customer. Every aspect of business operation is going to have some level of risk. The acceptable amount of risk needs to be defined. The important concept that many people aren't familiar with is risk capacity. So capacity is the maximum risk that an organization can absorb before it becomes insolvent. And so in the case of the shipping and logistics company that I used in the case study, they drastically exceeded their risk capacity. They ran out of financial resources that were required for their operations, so they went out of business. And so when you look at the nature of risk, is going to be unique to every organization. This is the reason that the board, the CEO, the senior leadership team have to agree. What are the boundaries? Given the boundaries, what controls do we put in place to make sure we operate within those boundaries? And what is the worst case scenario that's going to cause us to be insolvent? From my background in technology and cybersecurity, there are technology and cybersecurity things that need to be considered. I know artificial intelligence is the new thing that everybody is excited about, but not deploying artificial intelligence properly could trigger a risk event that exceeds your appetite, goes beyond the capacity, and then it causes the company to go out of business. It depends on the regulatory environment that you're operating in, the country where your company is based. There are all kinds of factors that require analysis and understanding so the right decisions can be made. Now, the amount of risk that people are willing to accept depends on risk culture within the company. If we're talking about a public company that has a board of directors, one of the primary responsibilities of the board is to establish risk culture for the organization so we know how risky we're willing to be. Some companies are going to be risk averse and they're going to avoid every meaningful risk that the organization faces. At the other end of the spectrum, some companies are going to be risk aggressive and they are going to pursue every opportunity that might generate value for the company, even if something can go wrong. And then other companies are going to be in between that and land at a more neutral location. What you find that's interesting is that startups are very aggressive, banks are very averse, and so the industry, the size of the organization, the stage of its life cycle is going to lead to some modification or transformation about the risk culture that exists within the company. But understanding the culture, being able to clearly identify and document it, and then using that culture to drive the risk appetite and the risk capacity for the company becomes a very important part of the equation. Once those things are established, then the C-suite has a important responsibility related to the risk inventory. And so business leaders have to know what risk exists. If a risk is unknown, it has to be identified through rigorous and regular assessments. Everything that's identified has to be analyzed, documented, and understood. You should have an action plan that's prioritized to address the risk that was identified. Progress has to be reported to leadership. And so an inventory of all your risks, whether it's a risk register or some other document that says this is all the risk, This is the impact to the organization if a risk event occurs in these areas. This is the budget for addressing the problem. This is the impact on the business if we don't address it. There's a lot of information about what should be on the risk register. That's the reason that I provided NIST 800-221 as a resource to help you as a follow-up homework assignment, kind of consider what should go on the risk register for your organization so that you can drive activities for risk management within your company. The business impact analysis is a good tool to help think about business risk impacts when a risk event occurs. You'll see on the left side of the slide, when we look at the risk area, we're consistently using financial risk, operational risk, reputational risk, and regulatory risk. What I've done in this, and the slides were designed for distribution. So you can look at this and you can fill it in with your own numbers. But what generally happens, if we look at the risk culture, we have a low level of risk as a rating. We have a high level of risk as a rating. We have moderate in the middle for those people that are risk neutral. And then we have capacity that defines what's going to lead to insolvency. What tends to happen when you're doing business impact analysis is that people use this in IT to determine how quickly we need to recover systems. But there's a lot of documentation in the marketplace that says you don't have to use business impact analysis exclusively for IT restoration of systems. You can also use it for confidentiality, for integrity, for business risk management, because the answer to these questions, when you do a risk assessment, identifies the difference between we have one risk that may lose $1 million and we have one risk that may lose $50,000. We're going to prioritize our limited resources on the thing that might lose $1 million. And that helps with risk prioritization and decision making, given all of the risks that could be identified within a specific organization. When we apply this to technology, especially considering that artificial intelligence is just hardware and software working together to perform a specific business activity, the use of technology in business processes doesn't automatically mean that cybersecurity and technology leaders are responsible for business risk. This is a fallacy that I see in a lot of places. Your cybersecurity and your technology people are going to help identify, given a formally documented, well understood business process, what are the issues, the risks, and the exposures related to the technology that supports that process? Who's responsible for the technology in the process? Where are the resources coming from? Meaning whose budget or people or process or technology are going to be required to address the risk? And if something fails, who is accountable? What you tend to see in the security and the IT industry is that the chief information officer and the chief information security officer are immediately terminated when there is a outage that relates to IT or security. But usually that outage is the result of business people not participating in the conversation, or business people not saying how critical is this business process. And given the level of criticality, the business person has to be willing to provide resources to make sure that the process is resilient. If a single person with a budget that applies to the entire company has to put controls in place to protect a process that they don't understand, they're probably not going to put the right controls in place, or they're probably not going to prioritize the issue that we're dealing with. And so as we drive close to the finish line and we look specifically at the role of risk governance, given everything that we've talked about, good governance is necessary to prevent systematic corruption, a lack of openness and accountability, arbitrary policymaking, and the deception of corporate or governance stakeholders. The idea that's presented here comes from ISO 37000. Within the document, they have the diagram that you see on the screen. Everything within a business, if we look at it from a business perspective, not isolating business components into silos, starts with the reason for existence of the business from all perspectives. So everything that you're doing in risk management starts with the purpose of the business. Are we organized to eradicate AIDS in Africa? Given the program that I worked on, are we organized to save trees, to put one laptop in the hand of every child, to generate the maximum return for our investors? If it's a public company, all of that becomes very important as a starting point. Based on the purpose, we can then look at the value model, the strategy, oversight, accountability. All of those focus on the elements for comprising value, engaging in strategies that are aligned with the value generation model, making sure that there's appropriate oversight from the right people within the organization, and then there's accountability that holds to account the right people for the right activities in the company. If everything at the foundational governance principle level, building from the purpose, is performed well, then we have enabling governance principles that allow us to demonstrate viability and performance over time. It allows us to understand our stakeholders and make sure that we're delivering value to them. It allows our leadership to be ethical and effective to produce positive outcomes. Data and decisions become a resource for decision making. Risk governance has an effect on the uncertainty that the organization faces. We have good social responsibility, viability of performance over time, and then all of that leads to the governance outcomes. If I do everything in the middle, radiating out to the dark band on the outside, we can demonstrate responsible stewardship of the organization, our performance is effective, and we have ethical behavior. So we're doing the right things that produce the right outcome. It's effective, consistent, and repeatable. We can demonstrate ethical behavior. Nobody's at risk. And now we can continue to operate the company indefinitely. When you're building a risk management system around this governance model that's identified in ISO 37000, the 6 bullets that I have listed on the slide really are the keys to success. You have to identify material enterprise risks in a timely manner. Are we doing assessments? Do we know what our exposures are? Have we put the right controls in place? You have to transmit necessary information to management and the board. Many organizations fail at communicating timely, relevant, actionable information to the leadership of the company when the leadership is responsible for oversight and making sure that we're producing desirable outcomes. With the third bullet, appropriate risk management strategies become valuable. And so it's the opposite of focusing only on PCI DSS, but rather making sure that we understand all of our risks and then appropriate resources are provided to reduce those risks to acceptable levels. The fourth bullet focuses on integrating risk management into strategic and operational decisions. The question should be, given our purpose and the opportunity that we face, what could go wrong and what are we going to put in place to make sure that if something goes wrong, it's not detrimental to the operations of the company. That would be a good example of integrating risk management and strategic and operational decisions. There should be regular reviews of risk management efforts. Risk is dynamic. It changes on a regular basis. 5 years ago, nobody was thinking about generative AI. Now it's the only thing that people can talk about. 3 to 5 years from now, quantum computing is going to replace every conversation about generative AI. And so we can't do a risk assessment once in 1984 and say, based on what we saw in 1984, our strategy in 2030 is going to be X. Because so much has changed in that time frame, it does require regular reviews of the company's risk management efforts, of the company's risk culture. Did we start out very risk averse? Have we ended up very risk aggressive? You can't answer those questions if you don't do regular reviews. And then all the outcomes from all the bullets should be documented. They should be presented to the board. What the board decides about the answers should also be documented so that there's a record and history of what was the situation, what were the considerations, what decision was made, so that you can go back and measure the outcomes that you produce. As we draw close to the finish line, and I saved a little bit of time for some quick questions and discussion, I spend half of my time with lawyers, which is very interesting. So I was in New York City hanging out with a bunch of lawyers last week. I was at a legal conference in October, and the lawyer's perspective is very important. Very often, your chief risk officer within a company is either a finance or a legal person. One of the things that's going to be valuable for every organization to consider, regardless of size, is do you have evidence of a deliberation about the risk that you face and what you're going to do to address that risk? This becomes extremely important in the case of lawsuits. I used to work in manufacturing, so anytime we had a safety issue, the number one item that came up was, when was the last time you did a safety briefing? Did the safety briefing cover the accident or the injury that occurred? Because that has an impact on the liability of the company. If we taught people what to do and how to do it and the right way to be safe, and they ignored us, The company is not at fault. That was an individual decision. If somebody is injured because of our negligence, well, a legal issue could lead the company to be insolvent because of the remedy that the courts direct. Pay this person $500 million because of the unsafe conditions that you had the person operating. That's just one of many examples. The thing that becomes important is that the board of directors, their primary function is to provide oversight. So the board or senior leadership has to provide oversight of the plan that we have in place. The board and senior leadership has to actually review the policies that exist and make sure that they're enforced. The board has to be aware of the results of risk assessments and priorities. So management and staff are going to produce a lot of data. That data has to make it to the board so that the board can make decisions about what to do. The board has to document the steps that they take to monitor compliance with relevant risk-related regulations, and the board has to be aware of any prior or preceding indications that there was a problem that could have been prevented with appropriate action. I'll give you a really quick example. In the United States years ago, ice cream killed people. And so there is a ice cream company called Bluebell. Bluebell had listeria in the ice cream. Listeria existed because of unsafe sanitization conditions in the ice cream facility. When the people were killed, there was a lawsuit. The courts said that the board was liable because the board failed in their oversight responsibilities. Their primary objective for risk management was food safety. They failed at food safety. People died. The board was criminally and personally prosecuted. And so it matters at all levels of the organization. You can't just have a food safety officer and then say that the leadership of the company is going to ignore everything. What I've tried to do in this conversation is give you lots of perspectives about lots of risks so that this doesn't become an IT and cybersecurity and AI conversation. As you think about what you learned, I'm going to stop looking at the slides, but I will move to a final slide. As I said in the beginning, Ruby and I are going to host a full day training session about this topic where we have a lot more time to go into more detail. If you're interested and available to join us, I look forward to dancing, partying, and being a tourist in Accra on the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th of March, but still doing great training on the 3rd of March. But the floor is open if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. I'm happy to address whatever you have in mind with the time that we have remaining.
Wow, what a great presentation. Thank you so much. The floor is open for questions, so feel free to put them in the chat or just raise your hand and then take the floor. Who will go first?
If you guys have no questions, it is acceptable that this was so awesome that I've left you speechless.
I'm sure we do have questions. Come on. Don't be shy. Ask your questions. Afeti, I think you have a question, so take the floor.
Ruby, people were much less shy last time.
I know.
While we're waiting for folks to develop.
Sorry, apologies.
Oh, there you go.
You know, this thing always happen when you want to say you want to do something, then something goes off. Sorry, a quick one here. So, I'm Afeti Kujo. I'm a digital transformation consultant in Ghana. I provide assurance to boards and lead organizations for digital transformation projects. So, a question that comes up often is that the board are so we have a CISO, we have a CIO, we have a cybersecurity program. We are ISO certified. We know about NIST cybersecurity program implementation. We are a fintech, so we have PCI DSS and all those implementations. But we hear cyber folks say that there's something called 0 day, and it means that everything we put in place might still not be foolproof to provide the adequate safeguards for our institution. So, as a board, how can we convince ourselves that we are providing the requisite oversight to maintain business resilience as far as risk and technology risk is concerned?
Yeah, Afeti, I'm going to give you an answer that might seem out of order, but just because I'm right doesn't mean you have to agree with me. And so One thing that I think is a mistake is using the absence of incident as the measurement of success in a security program. What becomes much more valuable and much more actionable as a measurement standard is to say that when a cybersecurity incident occurs, how quickly do we identify it and how quickly do we address it? If we operate from that perspective, then that becomes a good metric for the board to monitor. I'm sitting on the board, we're in the risk committee, I'm talking to the chief information security officer. My question to the CISO would be, what is the frequency of event occurring? How long does it take us to identify an event in the environment as a average identification? And then given the time between when we identify it and when we fix the problem, how long does it take? And in that gap between finding it and fixing it, what impacts have we seen within the organization? At a board level, because the board's responsibility is oversight, that would be a much better series of questions to enable a discussion that allows the board to measure performance. If the CISO says, on average, we have no idea how long vulnerabilities have been in the environment when we identify them, that could be for a number of reasons. We lack situational awareness. We don't have the right tools to detect vulnerabilities. We don't have the right number of staff, so that even if we have the tools, we don't have enough people to look at the tools to identify that there's a problem. There are numerous factors that could lead to that outcome. But that series of questions that I presented provides an opportunity to say, what is the root cause of the problem? There's no way to avoid 0 day just based on the way the technology works. There are absolutely solutions that we can have in place that say when something happens that we didn't know about it, we identify it quickly, we address it quickly. It rarely has an impact on the business because of the way that we've structured the technology environment within the organization. A problem in one place doesn't cause the entire organization to collapse.
Thank you, sir.
We have a question in the chat box. It says, how has corporate governance aligned in terms of AI governance globally?
Yeah,
Ruby, can I just jump in there?
go ahead, Etienne.
Yeah.
Keyaan, I know this is risk governance you're talking about generally. It's just that I want to lean on your cybersecurity experience. And my question revolves around a new area we're trying to break into in terms of AI governance. And what we find is that corporate governance is governed in South Africa by what is now, last month we launched King 5. So my question is twofold. What are the impacts of AI governance really making in terms of corporates globally? And I know that the EU have the AI Act in play, but I'm not tracking successfully. There's regulation and codes in play, but I don't know if there's real legislation. Can you comment on those two areas for me, please? And again, apologies that it's not specifically risk governance, but encompassing, the digital space. Thank you.
Yeah, you apologize, Etienne, but I do think it's relevant to our conversation. If we look at artificial intelligence, one of the things that ends up happening when you do an AI governance program is that the company must define what do they mean by AI in their context. Academically, there are 16 different types of AI. And so if we're talking about AI governance, but we don't define it, then we're trying to solve a problem that's impossible to solve because resources are limited. I think one of the starting points in the AI governance conversation is, what are our definitions? Do we have an information governance program? Because often the use of AI depends on the way that you're doing information governance. Do we have data lifecycle management? How are we creating information? Who has access to it? Where is it allowed to go? What are the regulatory requirements for that information? How long do we keep it? And when it reaches the end of its useful life, what is the process to securely delete the information? It would be impossible to build a relevant and accurate AI governance program if you couldn't answer the information governance questions, because AI always interacts with data. And so once you have those things in place, The other thing that I think becomes valuable that people overlook is an old school activity called business process model and notation. And so if you like, I'm a fan of the open group architecture frame. And so if we have not done information, or if we haven't done enterprise architecture, which is the business process of mapping out all of our business processes, formally documenting them and making sure that we understand the communications layer, the technology layer, the security layer can be built on top of that. All of those things become important because it puts us in a position for AI governance to say what specific business processes are going to benefit from artificial intelligence being integrated into them, and then what specific controls do we put in place to reduce risk of enhancing a business process with AI so that we don't have a data exposure or some other issue that might cause harm to the company related to our revenue, the operations of the business, the regulatory environment that we're operating in, safety, or damage our reputation. I'll give you a good example of a failure. There is a pharmacy in the United States. The name of the pharmacy is called Rite Aid. The Federal Trade Commission in the United States is the federal enforcement authority for AI harms because they treat it as a unfair trade practice. The Federal Trade Commission forced Rite Aid to delete all of the data that trained their model for their camera systems because their camera system said that if you were in the inner city and you were Black or Asian, you were automatically flagged as a criminal. And that causes harms. Because from the AI Act, it says that you can't cause harms to individuals, groups, or ecosystems. And then most AI regulations are some derivative of the EU AI Act. And so if we just say that Rite Aid would have been in a better position if they had a specific objective with their camera systems, they had specific criteria for data management that didn't lead to harms, that they weren't automatically selecting Black and Asians as criminals and then calling the police automatically. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are wrong. AI governance, if we use the framework that I talked about, would have prevented all of that. The issue with Rite Aid is that they have decades of intellectual property that they probably used to train the model, but the court's remedy for that stupid situation was delete everything that was used to train the model, and you're prohibited from using AI and video systems for 2 or 3 or 5 years. I forget the time frame that they're prohibited from doing that, but they lose significant business value because all the data that trained the model wasn't really related to the function of the model. And so I gave you a long answer, but the reason for the long answer is that it's multifaceted when you do AI governance. You have to think about how we're treating data. We have to think about business operations. I only apply AI to processes that benefit from AI, but my ability to do that is informed by me having good documentation of all of my processes. I think all of those are part of the equation. We can't just take a responsible AI framework, plug it into the company and saying, hey, we're doing AI governance. That's really AI management, not governance, because governance involves oversight, it involves leadership, it involves the people in the company directing resources to produce specific outcomes. You have to have those criteria if we're really calling an activity governance. Everything else is just management or it's an activity.
Okay, Afeti has a follow-up question. Is there a trending technology governance model for bots?
Afeti, this is going to sound like a crazy answer, but I would say the control objectives for information and technology, COBIT, is probably your best governance model if you are only focusing on management of technology. ISACA is a global organization. They do a really good job. If you follow the COBIT model completely, you have 1,202 activities that are organized into 40 domains. And then those 40 domains are divided amongst governance. So there's a governance model in the COBIT standard. And then there are management practices that are also in the model. One of the things that I'm always going to point to, given my previous work as a university professor, is that we don't have to create something new. There are lots of existing things that are available. People just don't use them. So I would use COBIT if I were focusing on governance of technology. I would use NIST and ISO. If I'm focusing on cybersecurity, I would use IAPP and OECD if I was focusing on privacy. But everything that we do is rooted in something that has existed for at least 10 or 15 and 20 years. Everybody's trying to create a new framework, but we have plenty of frameworks that are available that nobody uses, that if we use them, many of the problems that we have in society and in business would probably go away.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
For sharing your great presentation, and thank you for sharing your experience and knowledge with us today. We appreciate your time. I think we are top of the hour. I see our CEO, Doug, in the room. Doug, would you want to give us your closing remarks?
Thank you, Ruby. Keyaan, every time I hear you speak, I feel calm and I feel like I've been infused with knowledge that I've never received before and opens my eyes to opportunities and challenges, but in a very positive way. You're taking something that's a quite scary world, a frightening world in many ways, or could be viewed that way, and you're bringing reason and solid thinking to that. And so really appreciate you so much. Thank you for not just the knowledge that you're portraying, but also the way that you present it makes it very digestible, makes you very approachable. And I definitely encourage both the people here in this room and also those of you who are watching this by video to get to know Keyaan. He is a busy guy, as you might expect, because he is very knowledgeable and he is in so much demand. So we are very honored that you would take the time today to share this information with us. And thank you very much. We really appreciate you.
Thank you, Doug. I take this opportunity to wish those in the US a happy Thanksgiving on Thursday. This will be our last public event for 2025, as next month is our advisory board meeting, which is purely for members only. I wish you all happy holidays ahead and see you in 2026. Our first meetup will be Tuesday, January 27, and we'll have a guest speaker tell us how you can source products from Asian countries. And of course, I do have an event coming up with Keyaan in March. So for those who are interested in signing up, please reach out. Otherwise, feel free to take the details. I don't know, Keyaan, I don't know if you can reproject the QR code and the link so people can take notice. Thank you all for joining us today. We really appreciate your time with us, and have the rest of your day blessed. See you soon.
Thank you, Ruby. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
bye